This program is sponsored in part by the National Catholic Society of Foresters. Hello again and welcome to Looking at Social Justice. I'm Jim Grant and it's my pleasure to be here again to have one more guest that we've not had on yet. A lawyer who works for the California Rural Legal Assistance, Inc., a wonderful group of lawyers who actually help us across the state to deal with some very important issues, especially for the most disadvantaged, for those who really have no other voices but theirs and no other defenders legally to help them get justice done. Our guest today is Mariah Thompson, who is a staff attorney for the California Rural Legal Assistance right here in Fresno. And she specializes in environmental justice advocacy, which is one specific area that I'm interested in because of the Pope's interest in the environment, in all that goes on ecologically. There's an important need that we deal with that as a justice issue and not just something peripheral. Her main work is on the intersection of things like land use, the environment, civil rights laws regarding racial and economic segregation that we have so prevalent here in the Valley and in the city of Fresno. Overpollution, low-income communities of color, and the inequitable land use practices that are so common here in the Valley. Mariah, it's a joy to have you finally on the program. Why don't you tell us maybe anything that we need to know about you and about CRLA in its work across the state? And then we'll talk about specifically your topic, which is today the Equitable Community Development right here in the San Joaquin Valley.
Well, thanks for having me, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here, finally. I know we've been trying to get me here for a while. So as Jim said, my name is Mariah Thompson. I'm a staff attorney at CRLA. CRLA is a nonprofit law firm. We have over 50 years of experience throughout California serving the most marginalized communities in our state. So we work primarily with low-income communities, farm worker communities, other folks that have been really disenfranchised and pushed to the margins of society and don't traditionally have access to legal services. So we have 18 offices throughout the state. We have a lot of staff, and we're primarily in rural areas. So we're really trying to get those folks that do not have any access to services and who experience special and different situations and obstacles to justice than folks in urban areas do. So we specialize in that. I specialize in environmental justice law. And so what environmental justice is it is sort of the recognition that historically and today still, low-income communities and communities of color disproportionately bear the burdens of environmental degradation, pollution, lack of resources, disinvestment, economic and racial segregation, housing problems, etc. And so what we do as environmental justice advocates is we advocate to reverse those trends of historic segregation and disinvestment and start lifting up those communities so that they can have access to all the amenities and services and opportunities that more wealthy communities have historically had access to. And so the way that we do that in my program is I specialize in land use. Land use is basically how things are built, right? So when cities are built, when communities are built, what I like to say to my clients is nothing is by accident. There are people sitting in a room making decisions about where they're going to put every piece of manufacturing, every park, every industrial spot, and they make those decisions actively. And those are public meetings and government bodies that people have a right to go and advocate in front of and assert their rights against. So we work on changing those land use practices to be more equitable. And Fresno is a really great example of environmental injustice. Even I work in the county primarily, but the city itself is also a very good example. We have a 20-year life expectancy difference between South Fresno and North Fresno. And South Fresno is the area that has all of the industry, all of the distribution centers, doesn't have parks, doesn't have services like grocery stores or public transit or any of those things, to the extent that North Fresno, the wealthier communities, the whiter communities, have access to those resources. And so we see a direct health outcome, direct opportunity outcome between those areas, just based alone on how land use is done in those communities.
So the topic that you gave me, which is a great focused topic, equitable community development in our San Joaquin Valley, which for us would include 3 cities that you are located in: Fresno, Delano, and Arvin. So you want to give us a view from the ground on what's going on. And my first question would be then, what's new in what's going on in our valley?
So one of the things that's happened in the last couple years is California has passed a number of laws that have been specifically aimed towards beginning to address environmental justice. And of course, as advocates, we're very proud of this. We're very excited about the opportunities this can bring. But the truth is, what I see day to day is not much is changing. We still have a lot of obstacles to, for example, the development of affordable housing in our communities, a lot of obstacles, which are also, local government and cultural obstacles to changing the way that land use has worked historically and really making an intentional effort to change the circumstances in these communities that have been most historically burdened. So unfortunately, I wish I could sit here and say a lot has changed, but the truth is not much has changed.
Regarding land use, what would still be those burdensome obstacles and challenges that you're litigating over?
Yeah, so today I'm going to focus mostly on housing because, of course, we're in a housing crisis. Fresno is estimated to need more than 41,000 units of affordable housing developed just in our city. So it's obviously a crisis. It's been recognized statewide. But here in the Valley, we have a lot of things that get in the way of that development. It's not something as simple as rent control, though the new rent control law that just passed is fantastic and it's really going to help us. But one of the things we're seeing with land use is that there just aren't enough parcels, enough areas that are zoned in a way that it makes that kind of development easier. So if someone comes in and they want to develop, it's not as easy to just find a piece of land and say, okay, well, that is zoned for high density. I can build apartments there. And that process can take place easily. Instead, what we're seeing is that there are a lot of additional obstacles that a developer would have to go through. They'd have to ask the county to rezone, make it a more high-density parcel. They would have to ask for special permits or variances and things like that, which are expensive and they're time-consuming, and they don't always get them, right? It's a decision from the county or whatever the decision-making body is to grant that or not. And one of the things that does is that opens them to political pressure. And with these discretionary processes, you start to see these, what we call NIMBYism, which is the not in my backyard movement, where residents who historically have not lived in communities with high density housing, they live in single family homes, they start pushing back. You hear messages like, we don't want apartments here, we don't want those kind of people living here. You see a real stigmatization. And not even just against affordable housing or subsidized housing. In Fresno recently, we just had a situation where in a wealthy community, a developer of above market rate, wealthy housing was going to develop an apartment complex with average rental rates of $2,000 a month. It was going to be gated. It was going to have a pool and a fitness center. And hundreds of people from the community came out to oppose the project because they didn't want apartments in their communities. So it's hard to even put in apartments that serve the wealthier folks, so you can imagine how much harder it is to put in that kind of housing for folks that are disadvantaged. So that's one of the big obstacles, is you can bring politics into these development processes in a way that is really detrimental to equitable development. Another thing that we see is environmental justice issues. They have not gone away. They're not going away anytime soon. and the fight is still continuing very strongly. So, for example, the way that works in practice is what we see is, a county, like I said, decisions aren't made by accident. They have to decide where we're going to put industry, where we're going to put commercial, where we're going to put the Amazon distribution center. And what has been consistently done, and what they still do, is that they choose the industrial parcels to be in the most impoverished communities and in the communities of color that are primarily communities of color. So right now what we're seeing in local land use planning throughout the valley is that certain areas are being designated like, industrial priority areas, and a lot of money is being put in to developing new plans and new environmental processes to make it faster and easier for these kinds of development practices to go into place. And we're seeing cities and counties dumping a ton of money to prioritize and facilitate faster industrial development, but always in these same communities, right? In Fresno, we never see industrial development taking place in the north, ever. And we see these new plans for industrial development in the south. And for anyone not familiar with Fresno County, the south and southwest parts of our community are the ones that are primarily low-income communities of color. So we continue to see these environmental justice issues taking place, and a really strong resistance at the local planning level about changing these policies. And one of the things that is also a big issue is just that these decisions are made at the local level. There's a strong desire in the state to have decisions made at the local level, right? We don't want, the way people say it is, we don't want Sacramento telling us what to build where because this is our community. And to an extent, that's right. That makes sense. It would not make sense for some other city or some lawmaker who's never visited here to try and say what exactly has to be done in the valley. The valley is pretty unique, especially with the rural areas. But the way that happens is if you have a mindset in the valley where, and we do have this mindset, where environmental justice isn't an issue. There's a failure to recognize the historical significance of redlining, of excluding people from certain areas, of excluding people from opportunity. If your decision makers won't even acknowledge that, or they say, yeah, that happened, but it's not our fault, so we aren't obligated to address it, this is something that we hear all the time, then having that local control can be an obstacle. It can get in the way because they get to decide, and if they don't even believe it's a problem, how far can you even go with that? So those are some of the issues that we see regularly that remain obstacles in our work to these kinds of equitable developments.
The big thing you always try to do, and this is what CRLA is very famous for, you try to get community buy-in, community engagement. It's all community-based, grassroots. How are the efforts going with community engagement here in our San Joaquin Valley, Mariah?
So in some ways it's improved, meaning we're seeing decision makers listen to us a little bit more. We ask for meetings in the evenings so that people at work can come to them. We ask people to provide dinner in case they're showing up with their kids, because they're taking time away from their normal weekly routine to come participate in these meetings to give voice. But unfortunately, what we also still see is that even if the decision makers sort of tick the boxes on community engagement, what the community is saying they want doesn't end up in the ultimate decision making. It doesn't end up in the plan. So it gets to a situation where residents they overcome a lot of obstacles to come participate. A lot of our clients don't have transportation. They live far away from the places meetings are held about projects. They have families, they work long hours, farm workers work long hours. And when they take all this effort to show up and then nothing changes because they showed up, why are they going to keep coming? So we don't see as much meaningful public participation being incorporated into the processes.
What would you want to talk about the infrastructure issues that you definitely are dealing with? Everything from sidewalks, street lights, transit, sewers, the whole idea of what a city needs is good infrastructure, which we don't have.
Yes, that's right. We don't have it, especially in the communities where we work. So a lot of my client communities don't have access to sidewalks. They don't have street lights, or if they have them, they just have a couple. They don't have sewer systems, a lot of them. A lot of people don't have drinking water systems or public water systems. They're on wells that are often contaminated. And one of the issues this poses is that it's really hard to put new development, new housing, new services into areas that don't have access to infrastructure, right? Because what's going to serve that? Where are they going to get water? And you see with public transit, if there's no sidewalks, they won't put in a bus shelter if there's no sidewalks, but there's no money to put in sidewalks, so you can't get sidewalks. So there's all of these hurdles with infrastructure that unless there's a concerted effort to reinvest and to prioritize investment into these communities, without that infrastructure development, it's really hard to get additional services and amenities for communities.
It's almost like that saying we say up in New England, you can't get there from here.
Yep.
So unfortunately, the tradition that we have, all this stuff that's gone back decades, a century in the Valley, Dan O'Connell explained that it's been something that we've been living with for so long, we've gotten used to it, but people like CRLA are not, they're fighting it. You're fighting it. So thank you.
Sure, it's our pleasure.
What about existing housing stock? So you do have certain things that are up and running. What are the issues you're working with there?
Yeah, so in terms of affordable housing, I think people often think of affordable housing as, well, what we need is we need to build more housing. And we do need to build more housing. We critically need to build more housing, especially for the very low income and low income communities. But the other thing we need to do is when there is housing there, we need to protect it so that we don't lose that housing as something that's available for low income communities. And that doesn't always look like apartments, right? A lot of people in the communities where I work are homeowners, and they worked very hard for their family to own their homes, and they might live in rural areas because that might be one of the places that they can afford to own a home, and it's been in their family for generations. But what we see is that there's these homes are in really significant need of updates. They need rehabilitation, they need new roofs, things like that in order to remain healthy and remain viable for the long run. And so what we need is we really need specific targeted money to help these families update and keep those houses in stock so that they can be passed on between the generations. The other thing that we see a lot of is the threat to mobile home parks. In the Valley, mobile home parks are one of the only providers or access points for affordable housing for low-income people. They can own their home, they can become homeowners, but they rent the space that they live in with that home. And despite the name, mobile homes aren't mobile. Once you're in a mobile home park, the idea of moving your home is nearly impossible. So we're seeing a number of trends, right? We're seeing, we often and kind of always see substandard conditions in mobile home parks, where the mobile home park owner is failing to comply with their obligations to provide safe, clean service, parks, water that's drinkable, sewer systems that are working. So we see a lot of failures in that regard, and we really often fight against mobile home parks trying to improve these conditions so that this existing housing stock that is so crucial also allows people to live in dignity and to really have the kind of neighborhood that they deserve. The other thing that we've been seeing is outside companies, oftentimes large companies, coming in and buying existing mobile home parks and then doing things that ultimately lead to residents losing their homes. So they'll increase rent hugely. I have a client community right now that all of their historic rent increases were $5 or so, and a new owner purchased the park, raised their rent by $125 in one go.
Oh my God.
And we're talking about families that make $11,000 a year. And it's just not sustainable for folks to have that change. And we're seeing new rules being forced that are unreasonable. I have had clients that get citations for having a doormat outside of their door, for having their work boots on their porch, and these really concerted efforts to sort of move people out of the communities that that aren't desirable, quote unquote, communities so that you can bring in a different kind of demographic into these parks. So we see a lot of parks flipping, they're getting turned into tiny house communities. They're getting, their homes removed and newer homes put in. And so it's a real threat to people. Even in Fresno County, within the last year, we've had one park shut down and all the residents there get displaced and not have available areas for them to go to, so they had to move far away from their community. So mobile home parks are a really significant provider of affordable housing and something we really need to protect at the state level.
And that's one thing that you are actually involved in.
Yes.
It's interesting because just yesterday, someone told me, say a prayer, we're trying to get into a mobile home. And I was sort of surprised, but I'm also now knowing it could be a good thing if it's going to be a good mobile home, and if there's going to be no jacked up price coming down the road, and if CRLA is able to defend the rights of the people living there.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and mobile home park cases, I currently have like a case, or I'm working on a number of cases with mobile home parks, so it's very near and dear to my heart. I'm kind of a nerd for mobile home park advocacy, but those folks are some of the most vulnerable folks. You see a lot of predatory behavior, and there are some state laws that protect folks in mobile home parks, especially they're kind of recognizing this vulnerability. But there's still a lot of situations where those rights are not being protected. And a lot of times the folks living in those parks are the most vulnerable because they may not be able to comfortably assert their rights. We have a lot of indigenous folks that don't speak any English, or people that are Spanish speaking, that are monolingual. And you see a lot of predatory actions towards those folks because landlords can get away with it, right?
Oh, yeah.
And folks don't know how to stand up for their rights, or they're afraid to because they don't want the retaliation that might come as a result of that.
We've got about 6 minutes, so
Okay.
just to let you know how we're doing
Okay.
For what we wanted to do. Everybody knows that famous NIMBY thing. Oh, I really like that idea, Jim. This is what we should be doing. Just not here.
Just over there.
Just somewhere else. So what is your struggle, challenge, crusade against and working for overcoming NIMBYism?
NIMBYism. Yeah, so California actually has what's called the anti-NIMBY law, but it hasn't always been successful, obviously, for addressing this issue. So there are a lot of statewide attempts right now to address these issues, and one of the strongest is to actually remove local control over some of these decision-making processes. Because like I said before, there's a lot of political issues going on with local control. People want to get reelected, so they don't want to put an unpopular development in a neighborhood, because then they won't get elected again. So we've seen some laws that have been implemented in the last year or so, and we're still kind of waiting to see how they roll out, that takes away some of the decision-making processes of the local government. So if a housing project meets specific requirements, they can get what's called by right approval, meaning they're automatically approved to be in a certain area. They don't get to be stopped by the local government, which helps to streamline the process, but also kind of gives the local decision makers an out, because they can say, look, it's not my fault that this had to go through, blame Sacramento. And it can give them a little bit of face saving politically, which helps us and helps them as well. So that's some of the stuff that we're trying to use moving forward.
What are some major challenges that you're looking at right now, Mariah?
So one is what I just talked about with the local government control. One is the fact that we don't actually require an environmental justice analysis in a lot of the planning processes for land use. There's a little bit of change happening on that, but nothing that's really strong yet, and hopefully we'll see more strength on that in the future. Some of the existing tools that are meant to protect the environment, like the California Environmental Quality Act, are actually being weaponized by savvy lawyers and savvy developers to stop projects from taking place. So we see really, political use of some of the existing laws that weren't meant for that gets in the way of development taking place. There's not enough funding, and that will always be the way that it is, and we fight hard for that. And the funding that does exist doesn't necessarily consider rural communities and their special needs. So there's a lot of things.
What would be some tools that are available to you and good people that really want to just make this work in spite of the challenges that are there?
Yeah, so my plug for how people can get involved. First is to start noticing and paying attention to patterns in your community that you might be seeing around developments. Notice in the news when an affordable housing complex is shot down, and start looking for these patterns, and then start thinking of ways that you can engage. Land use processes are kind of convoluted and difficult to get involved in, but they are supposed to be made publicly accessible. There are meetings about them. There's Board of Supervisors meetings. There's public workshops. So if people come and participate in them, and they start standing up for these communities, even if you don't live in these communities, what we need to see is folks that don't live in these communities saying it matters to us too. And really getting the strength of those other communities behind our environmental justice communities. That's a great way that people can get involved. There's a lot of stuff that we're trying to do on our end with developers and kind of getting folks to work together that haven't traditionally worked together. But for what residents can do is start speaking out about these issues, start getting educated about these issues, and start looking for opportunities in your community to support equitable development.
There's certain legislation, we've got about 2 minutes.
Great.
Is there something about SB 35 or AB 72 that might be relevant at this point in the conversation?
Yeah. So without going too nitty-gritty about these laws, SB 35 is one of these laws that basically says we're taking away local control if you are not doing a good job. So the state has basically said, look, if a city or county is doing a terrible job at moving affordable housing forward, we're going to go in and we're going to remove their ability to have local control over the process in certain situations. And so that can streamline that process. And then AB 72 is new, and it basically says that if a jurisdiction is failing to act in accordance with some of their basic land use planning documents and requirements, you can ask the state to come in and revoke some of their permissions to do any development. So it really gives the state more control and more enforcement powers at the local level.
So are these bills in the Senate and the House, in the Assembly here in California, you would be calling your representative or your senator, your assembly member or your senator, or not yet? Are these things we can be acting on right away?
So fortunately, these have already gone into effect and been signed. So the way that folks can use these kinds of things is, if you notice that these kinds of things are happening in your community, that there's a large resistance to this kind of development, or you start noticing some of certain types of things being rejected or certain types of other things being approved that you think might not be right, you can talk to lawyers about it. You can call us, or you can call other legal advocacy organizations and say, look, there's this thing going on, and we're wondering if it's permissible or if it's something that should be looked into, and get involved in that way.
We're going to put up on the screen, if we could, and just to say, if you want to be in touch with Mariah C. Thompson, attorney, CRLA, Inc., it's at mthompson@crla.org, 559-441-8721. Mariah, it's been a joy having this first conversation about what CRLA does and what you are personally doing here in the city and in the county. Keep up the great work, and we hope to have you back with a happy update about some successes.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Thanks,
I really
Mariah.
appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.